Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Danielle Miller-Wagner, and I'm the Director of Programming at the Center for Environmental Policy at American University's School of Public Affairs. I'm delighted to welcome you today to our webinar, Prioritizing Frontline Communities in Infrastructure Investments. Today's webinar is the first in a new series we at the Center for Environmental Policy, along with AU Center for Environmental Filmmaking and the American Lung Association, are launching together in a partnership focused on opportunities for advancing equity in federal infrastructure efforts. This is the continuation of a partnership that we established to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air Act with a documentary film called Unbreathable and an online symposium and series of webinars last summer and fall. We'll be glad to share that link to the film and events in the chat. And now, to kick things off, I am delighted to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Andrew Wishnia. Andrew will share brief remarks and will be followed by a moderated discussion among our other speakers, followed by a Q&A with you, our audience members. Andrew Wishnia serves as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy in the Office of Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy in the U.S. Department of Transportation. Andrew previously served at the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, including as Senior Policy Advisor. Prior to his work in the Senate, Andrew served at the Federal Highway Administration as Special Assistant for Policy to the Administrator and as a Senior Program Manager at the White House Council on Environmental Policy. And now I introduce you to Andrew Wishnia.
Danielle, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to American University, the American Lung Association for having us, and really the great collection of speakers that will be presenting later this afternoon. I was just asked to provide some introductory remarks, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity, because we're at such an inflection point with respect to how we move forward with our transportation infrastructure. The role that I have at the Department of Transportation is in large part to help coordinate all of our climate activities. And really what we're trying to do is decarbonize our transportation sector to the greatest extent possible by 2050, with a 50% reduction by 2030. And one of the things that we're thinking about is how to create that pathway to actually achieve those aims. And so what I thought might be instructive is just to sort of provide a little bit of a insight insofar as how we're thinking about achieving those reductions. What we're thinking about to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to the greatest extent possible are reducing trips, shifting trips, improving trips, and achieving negative emissions. And that by no way, shape, or form is comprehensive, but hopefully that gets us sort of aligned with a possible pathway to achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions to align with the net zero plan by 2050. So just kind of wanted to talk about each of those buckets and sort of how we're envisioning those reductions. So within the reducing trips bucket, we're thinking about how to sort of incentivize and create as much optionality as possible for increased pedestrian infrastructure, increased bicycle infrastructure, and more complete streets. By the way, all of those redound to the benefit of the environment, to the benefit of healthy communities. When we're thinking about not only reducing trips, but shifting trips, we're thinking about shifting trips in terms of how to get people out of single occupant vehicles, not through any sort of requirement, but again, providing options where it's needed to get people out of single occupant vehicles and into transit, into options, including rail, and into other sort of less carbon intensive forms of transportation. Again, to promote sort of healthier living, healthier quality of life And then in addition to reducing trips, shifting trips, we're also looking at improving trips, right? We have the existing transportation system that we currently have for better or worse. So how do we look at things like transportation electrification and do so in a way that's inclusive, that's equitable, that considers community outcomes, not only before installing charging infrastructure, but actually during the operations and and after those installations are completed as well. And then that's really not sufficient, unfortunately. We can't just reduce emissions. We need to look at ways that we negate emissions that are already in the atmosphere. So that bucket contains things like natural infrastructure, contains things like looking at ways to reduce embodied carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And so if you take the reduce trips, shift trips, improve trips, and achieve negative emissions, that hopefully gets you on a pathway to net zero or close to it. And then in addition to thinking about that sort of viewpoint, we're also thinking about how to create a strong performance management regime, better climate modeling tools and analysis. And we're thinking about all of that in the context of how to create more equitable and livable communities. Part of that is, the president's Justice 40 initiative to ensure that at least 40% of the benefits of each of these programs go to sort of disadvantaged or minoritized communities. And so through program design, we're looking to every extent possible to weave Justice 40 and equitable solutions into all of our policy. And that leads me to our most recent effort, which is the President's American Jobs Plan. The American Jobs Plan is something that we worked really day and night on for a number of weeks, if not months at this point. The American Jobs Plan is really a transformative infrastructure vision to really realize and solve for equity, climate, and safety solutions. A lot of people are talking about the American Jobs Plan as sort of a once in a generation investment. It might actually be a once in a lifetime investment to double investment for transit, to look for an 80 plus $80+ billion investment for rail, $50 billion for resilient communities, and $174 billion of spend for transportation electrification, in addition to weaving sort of climate and resilience into all of our programs, including our ports, airports, waterways, highways, transit systems, and so forth. So we're really excited about that investment, and we're working diligently with Congress and both sides of Capitol Hill, both the House and Senate, to make sure that as much of the American Jobs Plan can be reflected in Congress's product as possible. And then finally, I should mention, in addition to looking at how we ensure a more just, climate-friendly, and equitable transportation system legislatively, we're also looking at how to pursue both the twin aims of climate and equity internally in our processes too. So we've stood up recently a climate change center right around Earth Day. And part of that is providing an opportunity for climate change experts across the department to look at ways to weave in equity into all of our climate strategies. So we're not only looking at, policy via legislation and via guidance and Q&As and rulemakings at the Department of Transportation, but we're also looking at processes, whether that's in performance plans or in actual apparatuses like the Climate Change Center. But we're really trying to institutionalize and embed the notions of equity and climate into everything that we do. So hopefully that provides a little bit of a snapshot of where we are. I know I only had a few minutes with you all, but it's so important that we're having these conversations about creating healthier communities where you don't have to necessarily worry about, being in a cancer alley. You can, potentially be next to a port or next to a highway or other transportation facility without having to breathe in dirty air. It's so critical that we have these kinds of forums to lift up all of the good work that everyone is doing and all of the important work that's to come. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for your inspiring remarks. I don't know about others, but I feel that the administration's practical, process-oriented, and equitable approach to the future of transportation gives me a lot of hope. So thank you. Now we will launch into a moderated discussion that will be led by Paul Billings. Paul Billings serves as the Senior Vice President for Advocacy for the American Lung Association. In this role, Paul oversees the Lung Association's asthma, lung cancer, COPD, healthy air, and tobacco control advocacy programs. During his 25-year tenure at the Lung Association, Paul has led federal advocacy campaigns that resulted in stricter regulations on tobacco products, growth in research funding, improved patient access to preventative services, and cleanup of air pollution from motor vehicles and power plants. And so with that, I bring you Paul Billings.
Thanks, Danielle, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Prioritizing Frontline Communities and Infrastructure Investments. Thanks so much to our amazing panels of speakers for joining today, and to our hosts at the event at the American University Center for Environmental Policy and the Center for Environmental Filmmaking. And thanks to all of you for attending today's event as well. We are so pleased to work with these great partners. Today's event is the first of a new series the American Lung Association is hosting alongside American University, focused on opportunities for advancing equity in federal infrastructure efforts. Today's discussion will highlight ways we can make sure frontline communities, those most impacted by major air pollution sources such as transportation, ports, refineries, and oil and gas development, benefit equitably from federal policies as they discuss infrastructure in the Biden administration and in Congress. This conversation is happening at an important time. There are critical discussions happening today about infrastructure, and many communities are suffering health harm as a result of outdated infrastructure that contributes to pollution. We urge you to join the conversation online, use the hashtag #CleanAirForAll and environmental justice, and keep that conversation going beyond today. More than 4 in 10 Americans are still breathing unhealthy air, and they are disproportionately people of color. According to our annual State of the Air report, people of color are 3 times more likely to live in the most polluted counties in the United States compared to white people. We know that we must transition away from dirty polluting fuels to clean non-combustion energy in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and provide healthy air for all. Infrastructure investments are an essential part of this transition. Transitioning to zero-emission transportation solutions, along with increasing levels of renewable energy, will significantly reduce harmful pollutants. The American Lung Association's Road to Clean Air report found that by 2050, transitioning to EVs would result in 6,300 lives saved and 93,000 asthma attacks avoided, a total of $72 billion in health benefits. Additionally, this transition is popular among Americans. A new poll we released earlier this month found that an overwhelming majority, 70% of American voters across all major demographic groups, support the federal government advancing policies to encourage a nationwide transition to electric vehicles. And 73% of voters support investing in EV charging infrastructure along highways and roads. We are long overdue for a significant overhaul of our infrastructure, protect the public health, and advance environmental justice. And it is so important that we get this right. This leads me to our impressive panel of speakers who represent a number of perspectives. Each of today's speakers has an incredibly impressive list of accolades. I've tried to keep the bios brief in order to focus the conversation. Today's speakers include Dr. Shelley Francis, a former medical school faculty member. She is a public health executive and entrepreneur. Her vision led to the co-founding of the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts, EV Hybrid Noir, a national 501c3 with thousands of members and chapters across the United States and abroad. EV Hybrid Noir's mission is to advance electric vehicles, and multimodal e-mobility solutions in the US, and to ensure those solutions are inclusive and equitable. Mychal Johnson is a community-based advocate for environmental and economic and social justice in the South Bronx. He is the co-founder of South Bronx Unite and a member of the board of directors of the Mott Haven Port Morris Community Land Stewards. He also serves on the board of directors of the NYC Community Land Initiative, the Bronx Council for Environmental Quality, and the Community Advisory Board of Columbia University's NIEHS Center for Environmental Health in Northern Manhattan. Carol Kriebs is the chairperson of the National Tribal Air Association. In her role, she works to ensure that NTAA helps to empower tribes to protect and enhance the air that we all breathe. Previously, she coordinated the air quality program for the Sauk Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska for 5 years. Currently, she serves as the environmental director for the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho. Mike Natchees is a Northern Ute and Choctaw residing in the Uinta and Ouray Reservation in northeastern Utah. He joined the Ute Indian Tribe Air Quality Department in 2013 and has served as the Director of Air Quality since 2018. He is also a current member of the Tribal Air Monitoring Support Center Steering Committee. Dr. Bakeyah Nelson has served as the Executive Director of the Air Alliance of Houston since 2017. The Air Alliance Houston works to improve air quality, advance environmental justice, and promote the health of Houstonians. Previously, she led a consulting firm focusing on advancing health equity and worked in the Harris County Public Health Office of Policy and Planning, where she was responsible for leading community health initiatives to reduce environmental inequities. Please join me in welcoming our panel. I'm going to open the panel with a couple of questions for the entire panel. It is heartening to see that the Biden administration is making critical connections between public health, equity, and the environment. And infrastructure is very much related to all these things. The definition of infrastructure is evolving. And so, Dr. Nelson, I'm coming to you first. I'm going to go down the line. What role does infrastructure play in improving public health, equity, and our environment?
Did you call my name?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. So thank you everyone for having me here today. So what role does infrastructure play? I'm really going to use this opportunity to lift up a highway infrastructure expansion project that we are fiercely in opposition of here in the Houston region, the I-45 expansion. And this expansion project is probably the poster child of what highway infrastructure projects have looked like to divide and really decimate communities of color and working class neighborhoods. The current design and that has been put forth by our Texas Department of Transportation continues with that legacy of displacing people of color and having negative public health impacts. So just let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. Our organization has significant concerns about the design of this project. From a expansion perspective, it's going to be moved closer to 26 schools adjacent to the corridor. And these schools will be placed within 500 feet of this highway. And these schools are predominantly attended by children of color who already, research has shown children attending these schools already use emergency services to treat asthma at a higher rate than other schools in their school district. We also know that this expansion project is going to increase, not reduce, trips that we just heard about. It's going to increase reliance on single occupancy vehicles. It's going to displace residents, over 1,000 residents from their homes. It is going to destroy cultural landmarks in Black and Brown communities. So from many different angles, this project, the I-45 project, is exactly what I think the Biden administration is talking about when we're talking about intersectional adverse impacts on communities of color and working class neighborhoods from an economic perspective, from a health perspective, from an environmental perspective. And so I will stop there.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, what role does infrastructure play in improving public health, equity in our environment?
Oh, thanks, Paul, for the question. And again, I also want to thank American University and the American Lung Association for having us here in this webinar to talk about infrastructure, transportation, and what role it plays. Just give you a little idea about where I come from, where I'm living, and where I advocate for in terms of the South Bronx. We've been the place where highways have actually been placed to encircle our communities like a noose around our necks. Robert Moses started this off by creating the Cross Bronx Expressway, which actually brings the I-95 corridor straight through the Bronx. It divided the community, just like in Houston. It totally decimated the economy, and it totally created total unhealthy outcomes for our community members, including our children. That was the start of the creation of two other highways that encircle our neighborhood that's connected to that Cross Bronx Expressway. All this was for the transportation opportunities for those coming from more economically affluent neighborhoods to actually strangle the South Bronx residents, to the point where we have asthma hospitalization rates 8 times the national average. 1 in 4 of our children have asthma. And so that leads to a really unhealthy, not only health outcomes, but occupational outcomes and educational outcomes. Because we know cognitive development is directly linked to the air quality our children breathe. And by no chance, we have one of the poorest performing school districts in the city of New York. And we also have one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. So you have all these negatives due to a direct relationship to traffic, infrastructure, lack of green space, but more highways than we can manage. And all this came, to our community with the whole idea it was going to create economic development and job creation. But all it really did was give us the exhaust fumes from these diesel trucks that are encircling us. Sorry for the background. But all this fumes coming from trucks, and supposedly in all these industries that surrounds us, we have one of the largest significant maritime industrial areas as well in our community. And we have 4 fossil fuel power plants lining our waterfront, which blocks our entire community of 90,000 people from any access to those waters. So I think infrastructure and how we create it for the betterment of community is super, super important. Right now, we haven't seen a lot of that. So I'm really happy to hear what Andrew mentioned about how to, sorry about that. Had to happen right when I was about to talk. But it's really important that we think outside the box of how we can change the decimation that's happened to communities like ours all over the country. And we're looking at how we can potentially not only create greener vehicles with with hybrid vehicles or all electric vehicles, but also like maybe even encapsulating highways that aren't going anywhere, but will continue to decimate our health and health outcomes of our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Francis, would you like to respond to that question?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. Thank you, American University and the American Lung Association. And it's a pleasure to be here with these colleagues. So in regards to this question, when I think about my response to this, I will say that there has always been a common thread between race, transportation, and infrastructure, with often communities of color, indigenous communities, Black, Latinx communities, as well as lower income communities, being at the detriment of where that infrastructure is situated in place, or where those transportation hubs and centers and corridors flow through. So in thinking about, my colleagues have already spoken kind of in terms of giving some historical context, as well as some real world context in terms of how infrastructure has been both an opportunity and a detriment to their communities. I will speak about it from thinking about today's perspective with accelerating EV adoption. And so what we see from research that we have done is that there are current charging deserts. So charging deserts are spaces where there's limited to no charging infrastructure. So while I applaud and I am excited about the investment in clean transportation and accelerating EVs, whether it's multimodal EVs, e-scooters, bikes, medium and heavy duty transportation, I'm also thinking about what that means in terms of infrastructure for these frontline communities who have often been neglected, who have not often had the opportunity to pull up a seat to the table because the door was closed for them. So in thinking about that, I would love to see more opportunities for these priority communities to be prioritized in this conversation around developing infrastructure, identifying where that infrastructure is placed, being part of the team that actually places and maintains the infrastructure. So not just thinking about infrastructure from a consumer standpoint, but also thinking about it from a workforce and economic development opportunity, because that is going to be a motivator and a driver to better economic health and well-being, which leads to better public health as well. And obviously transitioning away from fossil fuel vehicles can really make a huge impact on the public health outcomes for these specific communities that have been impacted first and worst by overexposure to transportation emissions.
Thank you. Ms. Kriebs or Mr. Natchees, would you like to speak more from the tribal perspective on the importance of equity and infrastructure? And I need you to unmute.
Thank you. So air quality is a huge issue with tribal involvement in a lot of respects, actually. Asthma is a huge concern amongst our tribal youth and some of our elderly. It's compared to 8.6 of the children around the world, about amongst American Indians, it's about 13% higher. So that is a huge concern. And then we have other concerns such as cardiovascular, as that increases among Indian populations, reproduction. We have written several white papers that address these issues. And for us, it is very important that we get that information not only out to Indigenous people, but people of color, because many of us seem to live in the urban outskirts of where development is. And so it creates a huge issue. I know Mike, I'm going to hand it over to him. He can tell some of the story about how they have been working to combat some of the pollutions that's going around with his tribe. So Mike, I'll hand that over to you at this point.
Hi, everybody, and thank you again for the invitation. When it comes to infrastructure, I think a lot of times with tribal communities, mine included, is that we generally live in pretty rural areas, and there's a lack of public transportation, things like that, and where people have to drive, great distances to get to the store, to make it to work, things like that. It's really spread out, and a lot of times I feel like tribes are at that disadvantage. And when it comes to, again, just transportation, we're seeing that electric cars are becoming more frequent. They're on the horizon. We're hearing that the gas-powered vehicle is going to be phased out in the next few years. Then that leads to the infrastructure problem. Where are the charging stations for rural communities? Things like that need to occur. In my area, we have a lot of oil and gas development, heavy energy development area, and that leads to our main air problem here. And part of that infrastructure question is how can we electrify our oil fields? How can we bring in solar to help, reduce these two-stroke engines that are powering these oil and gas locations? And even as far as just solar within our own communities, how can we get our community members or our tribal housing to begin to look at alternative energy rather than relying so much on traditional energy sources? And I think that's where a lot of tribal communities are at that disadvantage. How can we begin to explore alternative energy sources and make it feasible to where everybody can can afford it and it works for everybody.
Thank you. And I imagine that being on the front lines adjacent to that oil and gas development, the emissions are not only producing methane, which is driving climate change, but also providing a localized air pollution, ozone, PM pollution that is threatening the communities. Dr. Francis, I want to pick back up with you. You touched a little bit on the health benefits and transitioning to cleaner transportation. But you're at EV Hybrid Noir. Can we dive a little deeper on EVs and what we need to do in infrastructure to ensure that electric vehicles are providing health benefits, but are also available and accessible to all communities?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So one of the things that we know from research is that there are certain communities that are disproportionately impacted more so than others. And at the same time, while there are opportunities to purchase incentives or get incentives and rebates in more progressive markets, when you look at who is actually benefiting the most from, say, even the federal tax credit that we had for purchasing an electric vehicle, 80% of those who purchased or utilized that federal tax rebate made over $100,000. Then when you start looking at who is actually buying the electric vehicles, you are not seeing those community members who are most impacted. And I'm speaking primarily to Black, Latinx, Indigenous communities. And so one of the things that we need to think about differently is how we are educating and doing outreach and engagement to those different communities. So we can have the best policy in the world, but if the policy is not reaching those who are most impacted and who can benefit the most from it, then it's really not doing what I think legislators and stakeholders intend for it to do. But at the same time, I think part of the challenge has been that, again, some of these communities have not been engaged in the process. So they haven't been engaged in the research until recently. They haven't been engaged in helping them necessarily formulate some of the policies that are put into place. So really thinking intentionally about how we get the word out about these opportunities to get electric vehicles, what they are, or electric bikes, or whatever the electrified modes of transportation are, is critically important. And it cannot be a one size fits all approach. That is not best practice, and that doesn't work. And these communities are different. And there's diversity within the Indigenous community, the Latinx community, the African American community. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you're doing the right research and working with subject matter experts, along with the meeting communities where they are in this conversation.
Thanks for that. Mr. Johnson, you touched about some of the challenges that South Bronx faces from air pollution from trucks and ports and power plants, and the harm on your already burdened community. Could you talk more about the cumulative impacts on your community's health and what roles the local, state, and federal government can play in addressing these issues?
Yeah, we're actually working with our state and federal representatives to create community impact legislation that will look not only at one project at a time of how it affects our communities adversely, but how are they playing off of each other and creating a much larger impact on our health and our air and noise and all the environmental burdens that come from industrializing our neighborhoods or creating highway systems throughout it. So the importance of that is just to make sure that we're not looking at the micro, looking at the macro approach to creating healthier outcomes and making sure that it's required that communities, people and citizens who live in these areas that are being directly affected have real power in their not just advisory role, but a real power in terms of it being able to put down a project that's not meeting certain standards or exceeding the recommended standards set by community impact legislation. What we're looking at, the Clean Air Act is not being enforced, and there need to be higher standards. We're looking at how, each project at a time go through environmental analysis. Some don't even go through a thorough environmental impact statements. They will be building these things off of drafted EISs and move them through a process of being permitted. And we see that on our waterfronts, we see them with industrial sightings. We see it with building new industrial developments, depending a lot more on who's in power in terms of the elected officials, but that power has to be put and reside in with the. We are the ones who are being adversely affected. We're the ones who are breathing the terrible air, and we're being the ones who are suffering due to the effects of not looking at these projects in a more cumulative impact environmentally and how it affects us rather than the small project at a time or one project at a time.
Thank you. Mr. Natchees, you talked a little bit about the fact that your community is on the front line with the oil and gas industry, and then some of the issues that Mr. Johnson raised around the cumulative impacts. Would you like to share more about what's happening in your community?
Yeah. So again, I'm a member of the Ute Indian tribe, and I live here on the Uinta Reservation in northeastern Utah. It's also known as the Uinta Basin, and we're the second largest reservation in the United States. We have approximately 4.5 million acres that we see over. Again, it's heavy oil and gas industry. There's approximately 4,500 oil wells, over 6,000 gas wells in the Uinta Basin alone, both tribal and non-tribal. And one of our unique things about the tribe is that we are also a partner in a lot of this development. We derive a lot of revenue from oil and gas production. And so we have to kind of walk that fine line here to where we do want environmentally friendly, practices done. And we want to protect the health of our community members. But at the same time, we need to promote responsible energy development as well, because it drives not only our tribe, but the surrounding community. Here in the basin, we have a multi-jurisdictional area. The state of Utah regulates the state and private land, and EPA and the Ute tribe, we regulate our lands within Indian country. We operate our regulatory monitors here within the reservation, and we monitor for ozone and nitrogen oxides. So because of all the heavy oil and gas, one of our main problems is wintertime ozone. And it's actually a really rare thing. Most places see ozone problems during the summer or in urban areas, but ours occurs during the winter. And there's only one other area in the US that experiences this, and that's the Green River Basin in Wyoming. In the wintertime, it's caused by two primary factors. One is the emissions coming from the oil and gas industry, and the other factor is the weather. Inversions during the winter and heavy snow cover that drives our high ozone seasons. Typically throughout the rest of the year, we don't have high ozone. We're fine. Our ozone season is typically January through March, and it's again only during periods of inversions and heavy snow cover. So we may have high ozone 1, 2, 3 weeks out of the entire year, and it's both industry and the weather that's contributing to that. Because of our high ozone, we've been we exceeded our NACs for ozone, and that led EPA to designate the basin as marginal non-attainment. However, because emissions are still the same, we're looking at getting bumped up to a moderate. And we work with both the state of Utah and EPA to help kind of address these issues. And the EPA, they do consult frequently with the tribe on development of regulations and also development of federal implementation plans so that we can begin to address all of these issues. One of our concerns that we do have with the high ozone is, again, increased respiratory issues among our community members. We are currently working and seeking some data from our Indian Health Service here, our local clinic, to see if there's an increase in any respiratory patients that are seen following our high ozone occurrences. We can give the clinic dates. We know when we have a high ozone period, are they seeing any additional asthma cases? Are they seeing anything like that immediately following those periods? And so that's one area that we are definitely looking at. Another area of concern is just because of the high activity in the oil and gas industry, it's projected to increase. And so one thing that I'm worried about is, are they going to start putting oil wells or gas wells right next to communities, right next to houses. That's something that definitely needs to be addressed. And just all of the increased activity is just going to contribute more to the poor air quality. So that's kind of where we are at with all of that. It's just a lot of oil and gas, a lot of truck traffic. And so it's how do we promote that responsible energy development while at the same time reducing emissions.
Thank you. And I want to encourage the audience to chat your questions in. We're going to get to the questions in just a moment. Dr. Nelson, I'd like to ask you, beyond the oil and gas extraction process that Mr. Natchees just talked about, we know that refining and the shipping of oil and petrochemicals can cause a lot of pollution and health issues in nearby urban communities as well. Can you talk about some of the pollution and health issues Houstonians face from the petrochemical industry and from the transportation sector?
Sure. I think much of what my colleagues have said is also true in the Houston region as well. Just to put it into context, we have over 400 chemical manufacturing facilities in the Houston region that are concentrated on the east side, where it's predominantly people of color and working class neighborhoods. However, because Houston has no zoning, we have facilities that are really throughout the Houston region and in communities throughout the Houston region. I think Mr. Natchees was talking about oil wells and being put near homes. And we have quite a few communities that are directly next to fields that have oil wells that are active, in fact, and had recently, I think it was in 2019, there was an explosion of an oil well that was right adjacent to a relatively new subdivision. And so those are some of the very real impacts of having oil and gas development and infrastructure being able to be located right next to communities. In our region, we also know that children growing up along the Houston Ship Channel have a 50% greater likelihood of developing childhood leukemia than children who live more than 10 miles away from the Houston Ship Channel. We have over 800,000 children who go to school within chemical danger zones in the Houston region, and we saw that play out recently. In 2019, we had back-to-back chemical explosions that shut down entire cities and entire school districts for days, and which resulted in a public health emergency response. Mobile clinics had to be set up. There were significant health impacts associated with each one of those explosions. In addition to that, we have thousands of chemical storage tanks as well that go beyond just the manufacturing facilities that are also in the backyard of many, many communities that we're talking about. And the other thing that I would like to highlight is because we also experience, weather crises on a regular basis, whether you're talking about Hurricane Harvey as a flooding event, or recently Winter Storm Uri, that anytime that there is a weather-related disaster in our region, that there is also this second storm of air pollution because we have such a density of facilities in an urban area. So for example, during Hurricane Harvey, what we experienced was about 1 year's worth of pollution in about a 6-week time period. And so there was an additional 5 to 6 million pounds of air pollution that was released during Hurricane Harvey. In addition to that, we were able to detect a benzene plume over one of the communities with benzene levels so high that the city considered evacuating the community during that time. So these are all of the kind of chronic daily threats of living with and near oil and gas infrastructure and development, and facilities that are expanding, as well as the truck traffic that is supporting all of these operations as well. And so you get cumulative impacts on a daily basis, but then you also have these very acute impacts quite regularly as well when we have explosions or we have climate-induced weather disasters that cause flooding, damage facilities, and then cause the release of excess air pollution beyond what is experienced on a daily basis.
Thank you. So we're going to jump to some of the questions we received from the audience. And so first, Mr. Johnson, I'm going to ask you a question about how government should respond to long-term displacement, gentrification fears, as there's remediation or new construction of cleaner infrastructure, especially near major cities. So you want to take that, and then if others would like to respond, that'd be fine as well.
Well, I think the pattern, continues to be remediation fuels land speculation that generates gentrification and displacement. And remediation should not be a tool for land development, but the creation for healthier spaces for people who live in those spaces already, not for those who to come. I mean, the South Bronx, we've been decimated, as I talked to you all about, and we're now also being faced with gentrification. Well, they'll remediate some land, so development come through and build on it to fuel, speculation. Just one thing we haven't really mentioned about, if we haven't said anything about the coronavirus and the pandemic, that has made our communities of color more susceptible to the virus and to death, to mortality rates because of particulate matter PM 2.5. And all this is like the most important thing we're still living through right now. And it's all fueled because of the air we're breathing. And because our community of color is the ones that are more adversely impacted because they're the ones they build these things and they put these types of developments within. They're not in white, more economically affluent communities. And the price for clean air comes with economic vitality. If you're poor, you get poor air quality. And that plays out in terms of how your life expectancy is. And it plays out also with how our land is treated. And we look at how, and we have created a community land trust, like was mentioned, as you mentioned and introduced me, about how land is the precursor for all these things of causing so much harm, right? From where things are placed, why they're placed there, because our land's cheaper, because we're a community of color. Why was the Cross Bronx Expressway built in the Bronx? Why are power plants put in communities that are in indigenous communities or oil fields? It's because that land is not being treated with the same kind of value as you would see in a more white, more economically affluent community. And I think we have to look at the root causes of these issues. It doesn't start with air, it starts with the land. And what they're doing with the land is creating poor air quality, and it's causing greater harm to our people. Hopefully I answered the question and add some more stuff in there.
I appreciate it. Anyone else want to add, or want to go to the next question? So jumping into a little different direction, we have a question about the role of high-speed rail, maglev. Is it a good idea to expand our high-speed rail network, bring back old Amtrak routes, build maglev trains to reduce the amount of cars on the roads and the highways and less planes in the sky? Anyone thought about rail? Go for it, Dr. Francis, I can see you.
So I would say that in terms of thinking about rail as a potential option, we look at electrifying transportation as a whole sector. So if it's going to be electrified, there may be an opportunity to study that. I think that there's some more immediate needs that need to be addressed. And by doing that, we need to actually communicate and have conversations with communities before we just make decisions about what transportation needs people have, or what's the best way we think that we can address transportation barriers and transportation gaps. So having those intentional conversations with community stakeholders and leaders to identify whether it is piloting a shared ride system, having electric vehicles or other vehicles in the community, having more access to sidewalks, to bikes, electrified bikes, electrified scooters, I think there's some real opportunities there. So the investment in rail, that shouldn't be excluded from the conversation, but I think that there's some more pressing issues that need to be addressed before we get to that conversation.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to rail? So I'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, kind of with the COVID crisis and everybody shutting down, I think we're on a great way of having a lot of data collected so that they could really start sitting down and having a good conversation on some of the impacts of that. The impacts of air pollution with airports and stuff shut down was astronomically low compared to when they're out and flying. So I think that even though COVID was a bad situation, I think that we were able to gather a lot of data out there that we could use to turn some of this around and be able to have that conversation and have it well and look at what form of transportation is the best.
Thanks. We're running low on time. I do want to get to another question for the group. Andrew Wishnia talked about President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, and I'm going to redefine it a little bit. The president talks about the benefits. I think we're going to talk about investments and benefits to disadvantaged communities to inform equitable research, development, and deployment. What do you see as the key challenges for the administration when it comes to making good on the Justice 40 commitment? And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Nelson, and then work my way around. And we've got about 6 minutes left, so we're making about 90 seconds we can get through it or less.
I think one of the greatest challenges is going to be really listening to community and taking in and being able to implement the feedback that they would receive through going through that process. I think that it takes time, it takes investment, and it takes commitment to really listening, and communities are different. I think it was Dr. Francis who said there's not a one size fits all approach. And I think that is one of the greatest challenges to implementing Justice 40 is that communities are diverse. They have a diversity of needs. And that I think will be one of the greatest challenges.
Are we just responding on our own?
What the challenges will be for the administration to respond to its Justice 40 commitment and make good on it.
Okay, so when I think about this, I think we need to make sure we think about accountability and how success is going to be measured and what success looks like. So thinking about this now, like at the end of when this policy or this proposal ends, like what will success look like and how will success look in specific communities of need and frontline communities. So making sure that we have the right indicators to measure that success. And I think we really need to make sure that different representatives from these different diverse community groups, frontline communities, are engaged in the process of thinking about what success looks like and how their communities can benefit from this. Because since we're talking about prioritizing these communities, we really need to make sure that we are setting them up for success, resourcing them to be competitive for these funding opportunities, making sure that the policies that come forth in terms of improving infrastructure, making sure that it's accessible to them. But again, it really comes back to, it's great to have these policy conversations happening up here, but there has to be conversations between the treetops and the grassroots to really make sure that their objectives, their goals are aligned in a way that it's going to be beneficial. Because what we don't want to see is another divide happening, like the digital divide and the inequities that we've seen with transportation and mobility. We want to really break down some of those infrastructures that have really helped facilitate the disparities that we see today.
Thank you. Ms. Kriebs and Mr. Natchees, what does it look, Justice 40 and the challenges look like for tribal air agencies?
Yeah, so I agree with the challenge that we will be to make sure that all voices are heard and that the resources are allocated equally. However, tribes are often the last ones on the list, and the federal government has a unique trust responsibility to tribes due to we are sovereign nations, you know, within this nation. And a lot of times we are overlooked or we get little to no funding, which is one thing that NTAA does. And we really try to get that information out to the tribes and to help them get their voices heard. And we help write policy kits and stuff when different issues and situations like that come up. So that's a huge job of what we do at NTAA is we make sure that, you know, the tribes are at the table so that we are part of those decisions as they're being made.
I think Carol really nailed that with the trust responsibility that the government has with tribes, and communication is a key part of that. There needs to be that consultation process that's strengthened. There needs to be that government to government discussion that happens to make sure that the tribe's needs are being met, because every tribe is different. My situation is different than Carol's, you know, and so just that open communication between the government and tribes is going to be key to making everything work.
And Mr. Johnson, you're going to get the last word on Justice 40.
I think, again, trust has to be earned. We've been told a lot. We've been asked to be listened to, but what we've elaborated as to our concerns haven't been put on paper. They have not really turned out to be law that has been enforced. The level of trust isn't there, and I think that's what has to be established if there's going to be any real movement in that direction to create what they're promising or trying to do. It has to come from trust and build that trust by not just listening and not just scratching off an X in the box of participating or community participation, but really move on the professionals who are the people who live in these communities, know the answer, and they need to see the results of what they've contributed and action in terms of legislation.
Thank you. I think that's a key message that many of you touched upon. We need to work to build that trust, and that starts with communication, consultation, and then honoring commitments. I want to thank the panel for joining us today, and for all of you for listening and attending and asking your questions. We'll be sending out details of our next virtual event in this series about advancing opportunities for equity and infrastructure investments. In October, we'll have an event on building climate resilient infrastructure. In December, we'll have an event on the role of clean energy technology in securing safe and equitable infrastructure. I want to thank everyone again for joining us today, and we will see you down the road. And thanks to our panels again. With that, we are finished.
Thank you.